My name is Rusty Buroff. I grew up in a small town, great Christian family. My mom and dad raised me up in church, but I remember my first experience with God that I can remember was a negative one. It was when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and my mom picked me up from school one day, and she told me that Evan, which was my best friend, had just died in a wreck. And I remember, Evan and I grew up together. We were close best friends. And, he was the pitcher, I was the catcher. We played all the sports together and had an amazing relationship. And it's very tough for me to try to comprehend how God could allow Evan to die at such a young age. And ever since that moment, I just remember kind of just sitting in the back of my car, just, with my parents in the front seat, just on the way back from the funeral, just crying my eyes out because I could not fathom, I could not understand why God would allow this to happen. And that was really my first experience that I can remember with God, and it was a negative one. And it kind of set the tone for me growing up. And even though I had great Christian family, awesome parents, I just kind of went down this road that was far from God. And starting junior high, high school, I started making some really bad decisions, and I wanted to live up to the reputation of being the bad kid. And eventually, when I was a junior in high school, the judge felt like the best thing for me was to send me to the military. So between my junior and senior year in high school, I went into the military, had some good experiences there, but the first day back, my senior year, I got arrested again and ended up getting kicked out of school, had to go to alternative school. And that crushed a lot of people around me. For me, it didn't really bother me though. And because once again, just trying to live up to that reputation. Out of high school, I continued to make these bad decisions and ended up addicted to lots of different types of drugs, alcohol, ended up homeless at age 18 and spent months just living from friend to friend, breaking in hotel rooms, sleeping on the streets, sleeping in back of vans. And that was my life for quite a while. And the addiction just continued to pound in me that I just wasn't good enough. And eventually, I made some really bad decisions that I never imagined I'd ever make. And I broke into a bunch of people's houses and robbed them, and eventually I found myself in cell 121. And while sitting in that jail cell, the reality of my bad decisions, not just the big bad decisions, but the bad decisions that I started making when I was 12, 13, 14 years old, they just all came back flooding at me at once. And I remember sitting in cell 121 just wondering where I was going in my life. I was tired of being homeless. I was tired of living on the streets. I was tired of being an addict, trying to find that next high. And I was tired of spending my time in jail. This wasn't my first go-around. And I knew I was looking at 14 years. And I fully expected that I would be spending at least the next 10 years behind bars. And jail was such a lonely place. I remember every morning waking up and rolling that 2-inch thin plastic mat off the floor and just getting ready for the day. And one of the things I'll never forget, a guy named Merle, and he was in his 90s. He was a volunteer. He'd come and talk to me every Sunday. And he wasn't the most exciting speaker in the world. He would actually fall asleep while he was talking to me. But it really never made a difference what Merle said to me. It's what he did. And by him showing up every Sunday to that jail, it showed me that, number one, God could forgive me. But secondly, it showed me that someone believed in Rusty Buroff. No matter all the mistakes I had made, no matter my terrible reputation, no matter all those things, that there was someone who believed in me. And that was really my motivation to change my life. Because now I had someone who believed in me, no matter the stuff I had done in my life. And I had a God who loved me. I had a God who forgave me. And so I would spend my next year in cell 121. And during that year, every morning I would turn on the TV and it was TBN. And that was, we got 6 different channels and TBN was one of them. The other channels, some of the guys would watch, but the only thing I would ever watch on TV was TBN. That was the only intake of media that I actually had. And the rest of my time I would spend writing out the vision of what we now know as 180. And I still have those papers in the trunk of my car today of the story and the ideas of what 180 is and what I thought it was going to be. And TBN got me through some of the toughest moments. When I was in jail, I had a son that was on the way that I knew I was going to miss his birth. It was TBN that motivated me to continue. When I would come back from court and things wouldn't go my way, it was TBN that was always there. And the pastors, the people, I felt like they were speaking directly to me. And one of the cool opportunities that I had was the opportunity to tell other men and women when I was in jail about Christ. And to be honest, I didn't know much about Jesus. I didn't know much about His grace. I didn't know much about His forgiveness. I didn't know anything about the Bible. But all I had was the story and the testimony of what God done in my life. The next option for me, the best thing I could do for them was to say, hey, let's watch some TV, let's watch some TBN. And I can't tell you how many lives that I've watched that started to change when I was in jail, and I'm still have the ability to write many of those guys who are doing life sentences today. And it all started, sitting on a little plastic table watching TBN. And so I'm grateful for my experience in jail. And I wish I could tell you that the trouble stopped there, but after I got out of jail, even though I had gotten rid of the drugs, the alcohol, all the old friends, there was still the battle of my past reputation. There was still the battle of overcoming addiction. There was still the battle of being a felon. And it was tough to find work. And eventually I had a company that gave me a shot. And I worked there for 2 years, but there's still the burden of 180. It was still the burden of those dreams, those ideas that I had written on that paper, 2 years ago. And eventually I had the opportunity to buy a trailer for $500. Me and my couple buddies bought a trailer for $500. And our heart was just to start housing guys who were in our same situation, that were coming out of jail and prison. Had no clue what we were doing, made a ton of mistakes, but I'm thankful once again for God's grace, because He allowed us to open that facility at that trailer. And fast forward 6 years ago, I'm still the executive director of 180. We've moved out of the trailer, and God has really blessed us in many ways. And it's still awesome, because my life journey with God started in a jail cell with TBN. And the cool thing about it is my life story is still continuing with TBN, because our men, our women who are living in our facilities, who were once in my position, who were in jail, who were domestic abuse victims, who were sex trafficking abuse victims, who are coming out of homeless situations, when they're at our facilities, one of the very few channels that we're allowed for them to allow to watch is the news and TBN, and those are only two things that they can watch. And so it's been interesting that my life story started with TBN sitting in a jail cell, and today it's still continuing that way. I made all those bad decisions, and I knew exactly what I was doing. And I had plenty of opportunities to change, because I did grow up in a great family. I had a church behind me. I don't know if God sent me down that path, but I think He allowed those things to happen to me for a reason. And there's been many times, with 180 that, to be honest, I wanted to quit. I was tired, I was hurt. When you invest so much time and energy into people, and maybe they just walk out one day out of your program, there was many times I just wanted to throw in the towel. But it was those moments, it was the idea, it was the concept that God had never gave up on me, And so how could I give up on the dream that God had placed inside of me? And so, yeah, I think God has allowed those bad things to happen to me. Especially because they were a lot of my own decisions. But God was faithful in always being there in those bad decisions, and He loved me enough not to leave me at those bad decisions. I surrendered my life to Christ when I was sitting in a jail cell in cell 121, and to be honest, it wasn't, there wasn't a pastor involved, there wasn't a Bible, it was just me sitting in a puddle of my own tears, and realizing the mess that I was in, you know. And I knew that I was looking at a long time in jail, and I knew that my life was going to be drastically different. And I was just tired. I was at the end of my rope, you know, as in a place where I had no other option but to look up to God and say, God, could you forgive me? And there was no question that he did. And that next day, my mom sent me a Bible, and she highlighted Colossians 1:21, which is, in my mind, represented cell 121, the cell I was in, and she didn't know that. And it was interesting to me because out of that story, it's the case study. It's basically a case study of Paul's life. You know, it's saying, you know, I've been doing all these horrible things, but then I met God's grace, and now God has set me towards this path. And that moment, I knew that God was looking after me, you know, and I knew that even though I had done all these bad things, that I had met God's grace, and God's grace was going to be sufficient for the future, and that he was going to use my life as a case study of the radical love that God has for his people.